End 2025 and the United States run for Greenland. Defeat, my bold companion. You shall hear my songs and cries and my silences, and none of you shall ever speak to me of the beating of wings and the raging of seas and of mountains that burn at night. And you alone shall climb my steep and rocky soul. For most people, historic events happen all of a sudden and are a bolt from the blue. A war breaks out, a government collapses, a leader disappears. But history essentially follows a geographical path of nations, rising and changing with the success and failure of the nations in accordance with the scientific and technical developments. Scientific developments lead to fresh geographical directions for emerging new industrial mineral requirements and industrial growth. History is therefore slow, deliberate, and bound deeply to geographical realities. What we are witnessing now is not chaos, but a new alignment where the United States has not stumbled into Venezuela. It has chosen this. It is not about ideology, democracy, or morality. These are just jingoistic narratives, useful, flexible, and disposable. It is now about where power can be applied cheaply, decisively, and permanently, now for the subsequent exploitations. And for the first time since the end of the Cold War, the United States is no longer pretending that it rules the entire world. What we see with the phenomenal growth of China, the fall of European performance, a changed world market, the US is now choosing a part of the world which it will be able to control to its advantage for the next 50 years and therefore remain a credible power. The entire move has been made because it has recognized the importance of Greenland. Let's open with the United States' New Year gift to the world. It's Operation Southern Spear in Venezuela. What the United States is signaling with the forward deployment was something very specific, that the Western Hemisphere is no longer negotiable. From Canada to the southern edge of South America, this is a consolidated space, not occupied, not governed, but managed. It has signaled the blueprint for, firstly, energy flows, secondly, migration control, and thirdly, security flows. This does not require a permanent occupation. It requires denial. Denying rivals the ability to gain a foothold. As far as the operational deployment of Operation Southern Spear is concerned, it was a forward deployment with the air and naval forces and aimed at changing a head of state directly affecting the United States. Henceforth, each great power will control what is near, abandon what is far, and tolerate instability elsewhere. The deployment started with Operation Absolute Resolve on 3rd August 2025. By late October, they had about 10,000 troops. By 16th November, this had grown to 15,000 troops and ships deployed in the operational area and were hitting drug-related targets. And by the 29th of November, it has started route interdiction. On the 1st of January, President Maduro gave an interview criticizing the US and on the 3rd of January he was abducted to the USA. On 3rd January, the Delta Night Stalkers and 150 aircraft were involved in the capture of President Maduro, and he was flown to the United States. No US troops were left on ground. This is where the US has left the world with their action, and it's up to the world to react. On paper, BRICS looks formidable, but power on paper does not fight wars. Power travels on ships, aircraft, fuel lines, maintenance cycles, and political tolerance. Russia cannot sustain combat power across the Atlantic. Its navy struggles to leave port, let alone contest in the Caribbean. China can build credible military assets, but ships without nearby bases just become floating liabilities. India cannot reach Venezuela in any meaningful sense at all. The United States dominates the Americas, not because it is stronger everywhere, but because everyone else is far away. A word on Canada. Donald Trump never made a formal, serious bid to bring Canada into the United States. During his presidency, he framed Canada as economically dependent on the US. Canada would be therefore better off as part of America. In late 2018-2019, his aggressive trade posture, steel and aluminium tariffs, and public jabs at Canadian leadership reinforced the impression that he viewed Canada less as a partner and more as leverage in a zero-sum deal-making worldwide game. So Canada will have its pressures and part to play in the unfolding history. We are now moving into a world of influence areas, with Greenland as the primary goal for the superpowers. And what do the other superpowers think? Russia and China want near Arctic state claim seeking scientific, economic, and strategic roles in the Arctic governance and development. Secondly, resource energy. China dominates global REE processing and has sought to engage in Greenland's mineral sector. Thirdly, Beijing has articulated the Polar Silk Route concept within the Belt and Road Concept Initiative, linking Arctic logistics and broader global trade strategies. Fourthly, the supply chain security. Securing access to Arctic mineral resources aligns with China's broader strategy. And lastly, cooperation with Russia. China often aligns around Arctic exploration and maritime governance with Russia. Russia regards the Arctic, including areas north of Siberia and towards Greenland, as central to its national strategy, investing heavily in icebreakers, Arctic bases, and in the Northern Sea Route. While Russia denies plans to occupy Greenland, it uses Arctic geopolitics to critique Western strategic narratives and reinforce its regional role. And lastly, Russia has extensive Arctic resources of its own. Greenland is not immediately central to its execution plans, but figures in the broader regional dynamics. India and Brazil only have scientific, diplomatic, and climatic interests in the Arctic. However, for the USA, Greenland is an indispensable asset across defense, geopolitics, resource security, and future economic corridors. A front line in great power competition and Arctic strategy. Greenland and USA's goal for 2026. It's a US goal. Donald Trump is just an unpleasant executor. Greenland is the Arctic gateway and the key to the junction for the military surveillance, which will become more accessible in future with global warming and melting ice. The Duke Gap. It was historically vital for tracking Soviet and now Russian submarines and ships moving between the Arctic and the North Atlantic Ocean. The approximate timings for the move of battleships to the combat area are as follows. Via the North Atlantic Sea, 10 to 14 days. Along the Bering Strait, 35 to 45 days. And from the Suez Canal, 40 to 50 days. The existing stand of the US against NATO and the rest of the world. NORAD. This is the North American Aerospace Defense Command and continues to be NATO's one-point input on the Arctic. What is the aim of the NATO forces? Firstly, surveillance and ICBM threats to the current NATO forces. And lastly, monitoring of the Russian and Chinese activity. The US interest in Greenland is driven in part by competition with Russia and China, which have also expanded Arctic pressure. On NATO dynamics, Greenland falls under the Kingdom of Denmark, a NATO member, and the US emphasizes its partnership but also stirred a debate on how NATO could secure the Arctic. On Danish sovereignty insists, US moves to shift Greenland to US Northern Command from the European Command, reflects Washington's desire to anchor operational control closer to North America. Natural resources and critical materials available in Greenland. Greenland geology harbors deposits of the rare earth elements and other minerals, graphite, lithium, titanium, essential for the electric vehicles, renewable energy technologies, semiconductors, and defense systems. The strategic supply chain diversification. The US is heavily dependent on foreign, especially Chinese, supply systems and other critical minerals. Potential access to Greenland's resources could reduce this dependency. Oil and gas potential. While not a central US energy priority, surveys have identified possible offshore hydrocarbons, although environmental precautions currently limit their exploitations. The US strategic focus from 1945 till the Biden era. The primary US sphere of interest set out by the founding fathers in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was that the US, firstly, opposed any foreign intervention in both the North and South Americas, and secondly, they justified domination of the complete Western Hemisphere. The US strategic focus from 1949 to the Biden era. After World War II, the US interest perceivably changed to the formation of power blocs in the newly coined free world. All countries had their individual aims and were not ratified by the word community either. A Western and an Eastern bloc emerged. The Western bloc was basically the USA, Europe, Australia, and the Eastern power bloc was based on the USSR, China, and some East European states. The primary US sphere of strategic interest remained in the Western Hemisphere and became a collective defense. After the fall of the USSR in 1991, there was a constant jostling of power with Russia and the Allied defense partners. The US has continued to pursue its cooperative defense strategy in South America. During the Trump administration, the aims have been drastically downsized. The Homeland Security Corps, the Hemispheric Security Zone, and the Arctic Defense Hub. American interests in the Eastern Hemisphere have vanished. The United Nations post-World War II. The aims of the UN forces solidified into 5 core functions. Firstly, prevent escalation between states. Secondly, stabilize ceasefires. Thirdly, create space for diplomacy. Fourthly, reduce civilian suffering. And lastly, legitimize international involvement without domination. Between 1945 and 1990, the UN forces were primarily deployed in the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, and Mediterranean Europe. They were never deployed in areas of direct superpower confrontation, such as Central Europe, Korea, after 1953, Vietnam, or Afghanistan. However, in practice, UN forces only operated where great power interests were either peripheral or balanced, but not where superpower vital interests were at stake. With the growth of regional powers, this is no longer acceptable. Let us first look at our regional threat and the countries affecting our security and military concerns. These are 4 concentric areas that affect our security concerns. Starting with the outer sphere in blue, which is the normative and ideological concerns, coming onto countries affecting our economic influence. The next is in saffron, affecting the political control. And finally, the one in red, targeting the countries affecting the military and security aspects of our country. Let us take a closer look at the countries in the red security and military sphere, as this is our core function and we will have to defend and cultivate them against rivals if need be. For us, it is China in the north, Iran in the west, and Thailand in the east. India's security matrix revolves around, firstly, the 2 direct adversaries, China and Pakistan. The critical buffer states of Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. The maritime pivots of Sri Lanka, Maldives, Seychelles, and the Mauritius. And the extended variable of the country of Afghanistan. Let us now look at this in a little more detail. On the Western Front, we have the state of Pakistan, which, along with China, which maintains its stronghold on our neighbor Pakistan with the Karakoram Highway and the Gwadar Port and the CPEC projects. The US nuclear concerns and threats in Iran continue to draw the focus from the US too. However, with the 2026 US initiative and focus on Greenland, the Cold War importance of Pakistan has diminished considerably. The military balance may have swung in our favor against Pakistan, with the US preferring to look away from the NATO responsibilities and refocusing on the Western Hemisphere only. On the Eastern Front, we have the Chinese border tensions which still persist. The naval presence in the Bay of Bengal continues to be a source of concern with the Chinese tie-ins in Bangladesh. The Chinese military threat in Arunachal Pradesh and the build-up of military both on the border and the depth area continues and remains a matter of concern. The cyber and information warfare is on the increase. The world community looks at Pakistan less as a power and more as a lever or bargaining chip. In the emerging scenario, we and like-minded countries have to take the initiative in aligning ourselves in the new emerging zones of influence, along and in accordance with our new long-term goals. We and our allies have to have a similar outlook and cooperate with each other on, firstly, foreign and security policies, secondly, economic decisions and trade policies, thirdly, military alignments and permitted basing rights for preferential countries in continuation with our new interests, and lastly, monitor diplomatic behavior within the group in the international platforms to ensure unison of ideas. The influence will be nurtured through tools such as alliances, military presence, economic aid, investment, coercion, or shared ideology rather than with direct rules and treaties. Global alliance roles. The emerging world influence areas have been marked on the map along with the contested regions of Greenland, Africa, Latin America, and the remainder of the Arctic region. The emerging zones of influence are, firstly, the US-led Atlantic Pacific zone. At number 2, you have the China-centric East Asian zone. At number 3, the Russian-centered Eurasian zone. And at 4, the European Union zone. At number 5, you have our emerging Indian zone. And at number 6, the Middle East Energy Security Zone. Timing, conduct, and completion of the stabilization. This would perhaps evolve in 3 broad parts when countries woo their new partners and decide their alliances. The phase 1 could take perhaps 1 to 3 years. It will be when nations observe interaction with other nations to the emergent problems and decide which way they want to go. They would observe, firstly, repeated diplomatic engagements, secondly, infrastructure and port investments, thirdly, military exercises becoming part of the routine, fourthly, intelligence cooperation plans, and lastly, voting alignments of the countries in the UN. The consolidation would be done in phase 2 and would perhaps take between 3 and 7 years when nations notice, firstly, permanent or rotational military deployment in each other's nations. Secondly, defense agreements on basing rights. Thirdly, economic dependency structures. Fourthly, reorganization of strategic trade routes. And lastly, rival pushback power. The phase 3 would be the structural panel phase, where groups of nations have, firstly, integrated command structures, secondly, formal alliance blocks, thirdly, economic systems tied to the dominant currency, and fourthly, security guarantees after a risk calculus. The stabilization of the New World Order could take around 20 years. However, the driver of the issue would be the Greenland problem. The new dimension has yet to be resolved between the now big three remaining in the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, China, and Russia, and the NATO breakaway in the United States. How quickly the new wave moves forward really depends on how quickly and quietly the United States adjusts to its new secondary role.